Good morning, class. So since we all just finished our bell ringers, I want us to go ahead. We'll transition out of that, just that review from yesterday. If we have any questions, we can go over that towards the end of class. But I want to go ahead and hop in to today's lesson. So first, I just want to give you a few questions. You'll think to yourself about those, and then we'll discuss with some partners. So today we're going to be talking about conjugating AR verbs in Spanish. So first, I just want you to think to yourself about what does that mean? What does it mean to conjugate verbs? Why do we conjugate verbs? Can you think of any examples maybe in English of someone conjugating a verb? But just think to yourself the importance and necessity of conjugating verbs and the role that they serve in any language. We're going to be focusing on the role that they serve in the Spanish language, but I want you to think about that. Think if there's any importance, if you know of any ways. We've discussed a few times in our previous readings where we've seen like, oh, that verb is conjugated. If you can think of any of those examples, maybe think of those. And then why we conjugate them, how to use conjugated verbs. Just brainstorm for a few seconds, any verbs or anything about conjugating verbs. Brainstorm that, and then we'll talk. And I'll let you talk with a partner in just a second, okay? Okay. So now that you've thought about it, go ahead, turn to a partner, discuss that a little bit, discuss what you thought. Maybe if you're not so sure what conjugating verbs means, you can discuss that with your partner. Your partner might know. Just turn to someone around you and discuss that for a minute or two. Okay, great. So we're learning about conjugating verbs today. I think it's a good time for us to start because we've gained the general basis for the Spanish language and words. We're starting to learn how to use and create our own sentences, and we're starting that basic communication. We've been reading a few stories and we've seen how some of the words have changed. So I think it's a good time to go ahead and start and learn why those words are changing and why they need to be. So we will need to understand how to conjugate verbs in order to continue and grow our communication skills that we're already starting to gain. So our standards that we're going to be focusing on today, the state standard is 3.NL, which is understand a few familiar words or phrases in authentic informational text, authentic fictional text, and overheard or observed conversations. So being able to identify those conjugated verbs will really help us to see who and what each conversation or text might be referring to. Our national standard is standard 1.2, which says that students understand and interpret written and spoken language on a variety of topics. So just like our previous standard, the state standard, being able to identify the subjects and who or what the verb is referring to will help us to understand and interpret both written and spoken languages on a variety of different topics. So, for today's lesson, we will provide support from each other. From myself, we'll be doing some guided activities in class. We'll do a couple group activities and then individual work to assess that more specifically. And we'll be practicing this. This won't be the only day. We'll be practicing this several days to help instill the key concepts and the steps that go into conjugating and just to instill that. Because once we get those few steps down, it will be much easier. We just got to understand those basic steps and start out so that we can. So by the end of these few lessons, we should be able to conjugate a verb in any form with the given subject. And we should be able to identify the subject in the sentence and be able to conjugate 90% of AR verbs that are given. And this will result in the understanding of more words and phrases both in spoken and written conversation. So I say 90% because there are some irregular verbs that will not follow the steps that we're going to go about today, but we're going to focus on regular verbs, and then we will later get into those irregular verbs. So first, we need to discuss our prior knowledge. So we need to identify those Spanish personal pronouns and subject pronouns in order to know who is using each conjugation. We must be able to identify the subject in a sentence. So identifying those personal pronouns or subject pronouns in the sentences in order to understand how to conjugate each verb and who each verb is conjugated to. And then we also need to learn about infinitives, just what it means to conjugate, and then the subject pronouns, identifying what each one is in English and in Spanish. So I'll go ahead, pull this PowerPoint up for us that we can go through together. Hopefully we'll get some steps that'll make this easier for us. So, conjugating verbs, la conjugación. In Spanish, we're just focusing on AR verbs. In Spanish, there are 3 types of verbs: AR verbs, ER verbs, and IR verbs. AR verbs are going to be our easiest, our simplest. So we're going to start out with those, and then we will later, once we get a hang of these, move on. So, why do we conjugate verbs? Does anybody have any ideas as to why we conjugate verbs? What it means to conjugate verbs? So, verbs change their form to match the subject of a sentence. So, like we said, so we know who or what the verb is referring to. If we didn't conjugate verbs, we wouldn't know what the sentence was about. We wouldn't have any context to know who or what we were talking about. So what does it even mean to conjugate verbs? Kind of the same as our last question that we just talked about. But it means to give a verb different forms as it varies to person, number, or subject. So like we said, it helps to identify who or what the verb is referring to. Before a verb is conjugated, it has no subject, it has nothing connected to it. So before a verb is conjugated, it would have no connection to a person, to a thing, to any noun. So it's important to conjugate so that we know who it is referring to. So what does each conjugation mean? Here we can see our subject pronouns in Spanish. We have yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros, nosotras, vosotros, ellos, ellas, and ustedes. So some of us know what these are. We should be able to identify most of these. Some of these will be a little tricky. But yo is I. So if you said I need, yo necesito. Tú is you informal. So like if you were talking to your friend, if you're talking to someone you knew really well, you would say tú. Él is he. Ella is she. And then usted is you, formal. So you would use usted if you said like you to maybe your boss or to a teacher, to someone in authority. You would say usted instead of you. Nosotros or nosotras, that is just the masculine and feminine of we or us. And then vosotros is you all. You can see vosotros has a little star on it. We only use the vosotros form in Spain. So we might not use it as much, but we're still going to learn about it. It's still important for us to know. And then ellos, ellas, ustedes, ellos, and ellas is just the masculine and feminine of they or them. And then ustedes is you all. So you'll see that the left side is always going to be singular. The right side will always be plural subject pronouns. We can go on to our next slide. So how do we conjugate verbs? Conjugating verb, it takes basically 2 easy steps. So you will take off the AR endings of the verb, and then you will add on one of the following correct endings. So first off, we need to talk about those endings. Sorry, we skipped a few. First, before we can get into that, we need to know what is an infinitive. So an infinitive, like we said, is those AR verbs. It's the basic form of a verb without an inflection binding it to a particular subject or tense. So for AR verbs, like we're focusing on today, they will all end in AR. And it just means to, and then the verb. So hablar, Hablar, means to talk. We have caminar, which is to walk. Pagar, to pay. And then trabajar, to work. So as you can see, none of these have subjects. It's just the most basic form, no inflection binding it to any subject. It's just the simplest form of a verb. So like we were saying, how do we conjugate verbs? Take off that AR ending, like on those verbs we saw, like hablar, AR. You would take off that AR ending and add one of the following endings to the correct subject. So our endings are going to be o, as, a, amos, ice, on. So we'll add those endings and replace the AR ending. So if you said I talk, yo is the subject pronoun. So yo hablo. Take off the AR, add the O. Yo hablo. You talk, tú hablas. And just for every single one, all 6. So we'll always have this chart to help. So when you think of how to conjugate, you just pair that subject pronoun with this chart of endings to help us. Here's a fun song that helps us to remember. Just help us to remember those endings of each verb. It's kind of catchy, so it'll be good for us to hear. And then it helps to keep the subject and the ending straight. So keep them together so we don't get those mixed up. So here's that song.
In this video, I thought we could sing a song to help out with all the forms of most AR verbs in the present tense. But before you watch this video, you might check out the video on the endings of most AR verbs in the present tense by clicking here. This song is to the tune of Bingo. Feel free to sing along, and I'll sing it 3 times to get it stuck in your head. For AR verbs in the present tense, like talk, look, and explain, oh, as, almorzan, as, almorzan, as, almorzan, and ice is used in Spain, oh. Otra vez. For AR verbs in the present tense, like talk, look, and explain, oh, as, almorzan, as, almorzan, as, almorzan, and ice is used in Spain, oh. Una vez más.
Okay, so that song is a good reminder of the endings. O, as, amos, ice, on. It says, and ice is used in Spain. So that just helps us to remember those verb endings. Now, though, I want us to go ahead. We'll do a few activities together as a group. So first, I will conjugate a verb on the board, and then I want some volunteers to come up and conjugate them for us. For the class, you can have help from your neighbors if you need it. But we'll walk you through it, and then we will pass out a worksheet just to really assess, that we'll do individually to see how we're doing. And then we will continue to practice these AR verbs and what they mean and how to identify them the next few days.